In this tutorial, we're going to look at project acceleration, or what's also known as activity crashing. So what we have here in front of us is we've got a project network diagram that has already been created. We can see all the different activity precedences. We can see the critical path because the critical path method has also been applied. And we can see the critical path at the moment is A, C, E, I, and J. All of these different subscripts of numbers as well, they show the different durations of all the different activities as well. So if you're interested in the critical path analysis or the critical path method, that's been dealt with in a previous tutorial. So if you want to go back to my YouTube channel and just look for that tutorial to help you out there. The scenario for project acceleration would be if a client or a manager comes back to you and says, I understand that you've done the critical path method on the different activities with their normal durations at the moment, but we have other information that tells us we have to bring this project in earlier. We have to crash this down to a shorter amount of a time or accelerate the project to make it sure that it comes in a shorter amount of duration. And so as a project manager, that means that you have to go back to the drawing board. And it usually means that you realize that, yes, certainly a lot of these different activities can be done in a shorter amount of time, but it's going to cost more to do those activities in that short amount of time. I'm going to have to reorganize my resources. And we need to start balancing off all of these different factors to weigh in and decide what exactly is the best, the optimum schedule based on the different types of incentives and costs that are on the table. For this example that I'm going to go through, let's look at all the different numbers, the different figures that are available to us based on these normal durations versus crash durations. And so usually what we're done with is we've first of all got something that looks a lot like the work breakdown schedule that we would have done in the critical path analysis. We've got all the different activity codes here. Then we've got all the different normal durations of each of those different activities. So we can see that these map onto the different subscripts of numbers that I have on the different activities here in my project network diagram. And then beside that, we've listed all the different crash durations that we could possibly have out of these different activities. So for instance, my normal duration of activity A is 2 days. That would be the normal duration that it would take to complete this task, given the resources or the different personnel that I've allotted to that task. I have decided as a project manager, and when I've looked at it and investigated more closely, that I can possibly crash this activity down to 1 day if I really need to. Let's look at activity B. Activity B, I've got a normal duration of 8 days. I could possibly, having looked at it a little bit closer, that I can possibly crash it down to 6 days if I absolutely need to. But that's it. That 6 days is the limit. For whatever constraints are on that activity, I cannot crash it down below 6 days. It's just not possible to do that activity in less than 6 days. And then one more example is down here in activity H. Activity H, the normal duration of that is 1 day, and I can't crash it any more than that. For whatever reason, the normal duration is the actual limit in terms of how fast I can complete that task. The next two columns over, which is the normal cost and the crash cost, this symbol here is just a euro symbol. You could alternatively just put in the dollar symbol if you wanted to. But the normal cost is just based on the normal duration. What I had initially estimated would be the actual cost of completing that task based on whatever different personnel or machinery or resources I'd have put towards completing that task. So we can see here in activity A, the normal cost will be €5. Now, based on activity A, I know, like I've said before, that we can possibly crash it down to 1 day if we need to. The cost of completing that task in 1 day is different and probably more expensive than it would have been if I had actually just done it in the normal duration. And so the estimated cost of crashing it to 1 day, completing that task in 1 day, is €15. And again, I've got all of the different normal versus crash cost of all the different activities estimated by me, the project manager here. Something else that we're going to add into this example is just the idea of an incentive to try and incentivize me, the project manager, to bring this project in an earlier amount of time or a shorter amount of time. And the incentive is listed here. Just in this question, when the client came back to me and says, we need to try and get this in a lesser amount of time, the incentive to you is that every day that you bring this project in early, I'm going to hand you back €8. I'm going to give you a bonus of €8. And we'll see later on where we bring that into account. So that's all the information that has been given to us. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put forward a strategy of how we're going to complete this assignment, this example. If I look back at my project network diagram, I can see that the critical path has already been identified. Because this critical path, if I start changing the different numbers by crashing different activities with different amounts of days, so for instance with activity G, activity I, activity J, if I start reducing those numbers of the normal durations down by a day at a time, the whole path structure of the network diagram changes. And that means that every time that I change numbers, it's possible that the critical path might change. I have to keep a track of that. Also, I have to keep a track of the numbers in terms of the costs versus the bonuses that I have available to me. So I want to have two different tables besides the tables that I have here in terms of keeping track of, first of all, the costs. So this is the table that I'm going to use to keep track of that. And also this table here to keep track of my project paths to see if my critical path is changing or if I'm getting double critical paths at any stage. To give you an example of how to keep track of my costs, I'm going to fill in the first line straight away, and I'm going to fill it out for the normal duration before I've crashed any of the different activities. So the normal duration of the overall project that I have at the moment, based on the critical path that I see here before me, highlighted in red, is the sum of all of the different activity durations that are on the critical path. That is the overall duration of the project, of any project that you have. So to find out what the overall duration of the project is, I'm going to add up all of those different activity durations. So 2 plus 3 plus 10 is 15, plus 3 is 18, plus 2 is 20. And I'm going to go back into my table and say, yes, the duration of the normal critical path is 20 days. I haven't crashed any activities yet, so I'm going to put a hyphen in there. And the direct cost is by completing every different activity with the normal amount of cost, because I haven't crashed any activities yet. If I just sum all of those different values there, I get the value down here at the bottom, which is 115. So at the moment, my direct cost is that, 115 euro. The opportunity cost, or the bonus, we haven't crashed any of the different activities yet, so I'm going to put a hyphen in there as well. And so the total cost at the moment is 115 euro. That's how much it would cost to actually complete this project based on the normal duration, based on the normal different costs that I have there before me. Now, down to this third table here, which is the project paths. I want to set up my table so that I can keep track of all of the different durations of each of the different paths in the project. So we'll start first of all by just recording what the critical path is and the normal duration is of that path. So again, I'm going to go back to my network diagram, pick out my critical path, which is A, C, E, I, and J. So I'm going to go back and record that. A, C, E, I, and J. And the normal duration that we had was 20 days. And again, that is just a sum of all the different activity durations that are of the activities that are on the critical path. But as you'll see when we go forward in the example, you'll see that we have to keep track of all of the different paths in the project, not just the critical path. So I have to pick out all of the other different paths in my project as well, and again add up all the durations of each of those paths. So the next path that isn't the critical path, I'm going to go along the top here, which is A, C, D, G, I, and J. And again, I'm picking out any possible way it allows me to go from the start node of a network diagram to the end node of the network diagram. They are all paths in their own right. So A, C, D, G, I, and J. And I'm just going to record that A, C, D, G, I, and J. And the normal duration of that, again, I'm going to add up all of the different activity durations on that path. So 2 plus 3 is 5, plus 2 is 7, plus 4 is 11, plus 3 is 14, plus 2 is 16. So back in, the normal duration of that path is 6. The next path I'm going to look at is A, C, E, H, and J. So I need to count that one as well. So again, I'm going to go back to my table and fill that in. And again, count up the normal duration of that path. 2 plus 3 is 5, plus 10 is 15, plus 1 is 16, plus 2 is 18. 18. Next path is A, C, F, H, and J. And the normal duration of that path is 2 plus 3 is 5, plus 4 is 9, plus 1 is 10, plus 2 is 12. So fill in 12. And the next path is B, F, H, and J. And the duration of that path is 8 plus 4 is 12, plus 1 is 13, plus 2 is 15. And so I've got 5 different pathways through that project network diagram at the moment. There is no other way that I can get from the start mode, follow through a path, and get to the end node. I've recorded all of the different paths, and I've added up all of the different durations of each of the different activities on each of those paths to get the actual normal durations of all those paths. So we can see here why the critical path again is the critical path. It's the path that takes the longest amount of time. All of these other paths, compared to the overall project duration, which is the duration of the critical path, they all have a little bit of slippage, meaning that they have a little bit of leeway that if any of those different tasks slip a little bit, the overall project duration won't slip. So the overall project duration is the normal duration of the critical path, which is 20 days. At this stage, we're almost ready to start thinking about crashing different activities. But before we do that, again, I want to go back here and think about this normal versus crashed amount of money here in terms of cost. We want to really keep track of exactly how much it's going to cost us to crash each of these different activities. And the whole idea behind it is we prioritize the ones that is going to allow us to crash the overall project duration, but is also going to allow us to do that with the least amount of cost to us. Now, if the project that you are dealing with, if cost isn't an issue and it's just absolutely essential that you have to crash the project no matter what the cost is, then this step doesn't really matter that much. But as we all know, money talks, so usually cost is a big factor. And the way that we have put down the cost so far in terms of normal versus the crashed amount of money here is with the example of activity E, for instance. I've got a normal amount of 20 euro. So to complete the task E in 10 days, that would cost me 20 euro. If I wanted to complete the task E in 6 days, then it's going to cost a lot more. It's going to cost me 40 euro. Because I need to peel back the actual project day by day because of the nature of the changing critical paths to keep track of it, I need to keep a track of exactly how much it's going to cost me to crash each activity by a single day, rather than this idea of having just this was going to cost me an extra 20 euro to crash it by 4 days. So to do that, based on the figures that I have at the moment, I'm just going to kind of get a rough estimate, and I'm going to say, well, if it costs me 20 euro to crash the activity E by 4 days, then to crash it by 1 day, I'm just going to take 20 euro, divide it by 4, and to give me the figure 5 euro. So on average, roughly, it will cost me 5 euro to crash activity E by each single day that I'm allowed to crash it by. Now, based on these examples, I usually do that logic in my head, but I could easily write out a formula to help me do it if I wanted to. So just give myself a little bit of room here. And what I'm going to do is what the calculation was there that I just did. I'm just going to say the crash amount, which is crash euro, subtract the normal amount, whatever that normal cost is, put that in brackets. And what I'm going to do then is I'm going to divide in the normal duration minus the crash duration. This will give me the expedite cost slope. So again, if I went through the example of activity E there again, just to check my figures, the crashed amount, which is 40, minus the normal amount, which is 20 euro, that will give me 20. Then divide that by the normal duration, which is 10, minus the crash duration, which is 6, that will give me 4. 20 divided by 4 gives me 5, which is the expedite cost slope of that activity. So I want to apply that formula or apply that logic to each of those different activities all the way down. So activity A, first of all, the crash duration is 15, minus the normal duration is 5. That gives me 10, divided by 1 is 10 euro. In activity B, if it's going to cost me €22 to do it in a normal duration of 8 days and €32 to cost me to crash it to 6 days, then the expedite cost slope of that is 8 divided by 2 is 4. The next one is 3 divided by 1, which is 3. Activity D is 6 divided by 1, which is 6. Already done activity E. Activity F is 15 minus 8, which is 7. 7 divided by 1 is 7. Activity G is 10 minus 9 is 1, divided by 1 is 1. Activity H is 10, and 10, now hold on, activity H actually can't be crashed, so that's pointless. We'll just put a hyphen there. Activity I is 10 minus 8, which is 2. 2 divided by 1 is 2. And then activity J, 20 minus 12 is 8. 8 divided by 1 is 8. So we can see a lot more clearly roughly how much it costs us to crash each of the different activities per day. So because I'm going to peel back this project day by day, I can see the cheapest activities that I can crash first of all. Now, if I look at all of those different expedite cost slopes for each of the different activities, I can see one that stands out, which is activity G. It's the cheapest one to crash. And my first incentive might be to crash that activity G. But we have to be careful, and here is where the skill in terms of accelerating projects come in. If I go back to my project network diagram, and I look at my layout and I look at my critical path, activity G isn't on the critical path. So even though it doesn't cost me a whole lot to crash that activity, and I can crash it from 4 days down to 3 days, if I do that, the overall project duration won't come down at all, because the overall project duration is defined or dictated by the duration of the critical path. Because G isn't on that critical path, I can crash it all I want, but it's not going to bring the project in any sooner. And here's where the importance of the critical path raises its head again. This shows you how important this critical path is as a project manager. The critical path is the one that dictates how long the overall project will take. And so if I was to crash G, all that would happen is that I would just get more slack on that path. I would get more slack around path or around activity G. The overall project duration wouldn't change. So it's not an option for me as a project manager because I won't get my bonus if I crash G the way that it is at the moment. So I have to go back again and look at all my different activities, but really only look at activities that are on the critical path because they are the ones that are going to make a difference to the overall project duration. So A, C, E, I, and J. If I look at the expedite cost slopes of each one of those, A, C, E, I, and J. So again, I see out of those 5 different activities, activity I is the cheapest one. And I can see I have the opportunity to crash I from 3 days down to 2 days. It'll cost me €2 to do that. 2 extra euros if you like. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the cheapest one that is on the critical path. So I'm going to move down and I'm going to start into that process. So on my second table here, which has to do with costs, I'm going to say, well, I'm going to crash activity I. Because it's on the critical path, it's going to bring down the overall project duration by 1 day, which will bring it down to 19. The activity crashed is I. Now, as well as putting in I in there, because I has only got 1 day which I can crash it. Once I crash it down to 2 days, that's it. I can't crash it anymore. So to keep track of that, usually when that happens, I put in a little asterisk into it just to say that this activity has been crashed to the limit. I can't crash it any more than that. The direct cost, well, the direct cost of doing this project in the way that it is, crashing I by 1 day and having all the other costs of all the different activities which were there before, I'm just going to be adding an extra €2 onto the overall cost that was there originally. So it's €115 plus the extra €2 to crash activity I by 1 day, which will give me €117. The bonus or the opportunity cost, my client has offered me €8 for every day I bring this project in early. I want to balance off the costs of my activity versus the actual bonuses that I get on the other hand. And so what I'm going to say here is I'm going to put in -8 there. So my overall cost, if I do this, will be 117 -8, which will be 109 euro. And what I'm trying to do is I'm going to try and bring the overall total cost of my whole project as low as possible. And then that's when I know I've got the optimum schedule for my scenario. Just as we've taken a look at the costs and we're keeping track of the costs, as we pull back the actual project duration one day at a time, we also have to keep an eye on what's happening to our project paths. So again, just to point out, in my project network diagram, this was the original layout. I did my critical path analysis. I defined what my critical path was. Now that I've changed one of these numbers, the actual duration of one of these activities, well, you can imagine the effect that that would have had on my critical path analysis if I were to do it again. Rather than do the critical path analysis every single time I change one of the numbers, which would be really laborious, I'm going to take a shortcut. I'm just going to keep an eye on what's happening to each of the different paths that are on my project network diagram to see the effect that changing the duration of I will have. So for instance, in the critical path, which is this first project path that I listed here, the normal duration with I having a normal duration of 3 give me an overall project duration of 20. But once I crash I, and again I'm just going to go I and asterisk there, that now, because I is on that path, that 20 reduces to 19 because I've crashed I from 3 days down to 2 days. And it will have the same effect for all the other paths that I is on. They will all reduce their durations by 1. So I'm going to look down through all of my different paths. Any of those paths that have I on them, it's going to reduce their project duration by 1. So this path here had a normal duration of 16. Because I is on it, that now goes down to 15. I isn't on this path, so that path duration stays the same. It stays at 18. This path also doesn't have I, so that path stays at 12. And this path stays at 15 because I isn't on that one either. So I'm keeping track of what my paths are looking like. At the moment, after I've crashed I by 1 day, this still remains the critical path, but the overall duration of that critical path is 19, and therefore, as we've seen, the overall project duration is 19. Now that I've crashed my project by 1 day, I'm going to go back and look for the next thing that I'm going to crash. The next activity that I can crash. Again, it has to be on the critical path. I has been completely crashed out, so I don't, or I can't look at I anymore because that's been crashed down to 2 and that's the limit on it. That was that one. The next cheapest there is C. And so again, I'm going to look at C. C is on the critical path, so it definitely is a contender. There's no other activity there that is on the critical path and is cheaper than C. Looking at the way that I can crash C, at the moment the normal duration is 3 days. I can possibly crash it down to 2 days if I want. It has a normal cost of 10 euro. The crash cost, if I was to crash it down to 2 days, is 13 euro. So that's the next best activity that I can crash. And so let's go about it. Remember that I've only got 1 day to play with here. So again, the duration of the project once I crash C by 1 day is 18. The activity crashed is C, asterisk because it can't be crashed anymore, just so I can keep track of that. The overall cost is 3 euro to crash it by that extra day, so add 3 euro to 117. The overall cost of the project now is 120 euro. Because I'm bringing it in another day early, that is 2 days early, I'm going to get double the bonus. So now my bonus is 16, so my opportunity cost is minus 16 euro. And so the overall total cost of my project is 104 euro. And again, that's what I like to see, that the cost is going down for me. That's the barometer, that's the litmus test to see the best or optimum schedule for me, the project manager. I have to keep track of my paths as well. So I'm going to go down to my project paths list. Again, I'm going to list the activity that I crashed. Any of these paths that have C on it, they're all going to reduce by 1 day. So the critical path, that reduces from 19 down to 18 because C is on it. this path goes from 15 down to 14. This path has C on it, so that goes from 18 down to 17. This path has C on it, so that goes from 12 down to 11. And this path doesn't have C on it, so that stays at 15. Okay. We can still see that the critical path structure is still the same, that path here at the top still has the longest duration, A, C, E, I, and J, so it is still the critical path. Now I'm going to move back up and pick out my next best activity that I can crack. Activity C is now maxed out, so I'm going to put an asterisk beside that. And so A, C, E, I, and J were the activities that were on the critical path. So the next cheapest item on that is activity E at a cost of €5 a day. And this time I've got a little bit more to play with here. I can crash it by 4 days in total. So I'm going to do that. Again, the duration here, it reduces from 18 down to 17. I'm going to crash E, no asterisks this time because I've got other days to play with after I crash it by 1 day. The overall cost of crashing activity E by 1 day at a time is €5. So that's the direct cost is €120 plus 5 is €125. Because I'm bringing it in 3 days early, I'm going to get a bonus of €24. So my opportunity cost is minus 24. And so my total cost is 101. And so again, it's going in the right direction. So that's good. Again, I'm going to keep track of how my project paths are looking. So any of these paths that contain the activity E, they're all going to reduce by 1 day. So the critical path, obviously that has E, so that's going to reduce from 18 down to 17. This path here doesn't have E. E isn't on that, so that stays at 14. This path here does have E, that goes from 17 down to 16. This path doesn't have E, so that stays at 11. And the last path stays at 15. E isn't on that either. So again, keeping track that yes, my critical path is still the same. Yes, it is. So I can keep going. And again, I don't need to go and pick another activity. I've still got more to play here with E, so I can crash E by another day. So straight away, I'm going to crash E by another day. So bringing the whole overall project duration from 17 down to 16, crashing E by another day. It's going to cost me €130. The opportunity cost is minus 32, and the overall cost there is €98. Going in the right direction, everything is good. Again, I'm going to keep track of crashing E by another day, how that's going to change my different paths. So again, the critical path is going to reduce by 1 day. That goes from 17 down to 16. It's not on that path, so that stays at 14. E is on this path, so that goes from 16 down to 15. It isn't on this path, so that stays at 11, and E isn't on the last path, so that stays at 15. Again, my critical path is still the same. It's still the one with the longest duration, so I can keep going. I'm going to crash E by another day. So it's from 16 down to 15. Crashing E by another day. I've only got 1 more day to play with after this. The direct cost is another €5 for the extra day that I'm crashing it, so 130 plus 5 is 135. The opportunity cost is another €8, so minus 40. 135 minus 40 is €95, going in the right direction all the time. It's all looking good for me, the project manager. I'm going to keep track of how this crashing of E by an extra day is going to change my paths, if at all. And so again, my critical path, it is on that, so that goes from 16 down to 15. It isn't on this next path, so that stays at 14. The next path, it is on that path, so that goes from 15 down to 14. The next path, E isn't on that path, so that stays at 11. And the next path here, B, F, H, J, it isn't on that path, so that stays at 15. Now, here we go. This is why we do this table down here. We can see that this was the original critical path. I've crashed lots of different activities, and I was keeping track of how the different path durations were moving based on the different activities I was crashing. This path down here at the bottom, the B, F, H, and J, that has suddenly now got a duration of 15 days as well as the critical path. So if I go back to my project network diagram and I pick out that path B, F, H, and J, that also now has become critical. It has a duration of 15 days, just like this original critical path has as well. So what I have is I've got a dual critical path. I've got two paths that have the same duration. And so that complicates things when I want to accelerate a project because now I have to make sure that I crash both of those paths by 1 day at the same time. Because, for instance, if I was to crash an activity on one of those paths and not crash an activity on another path, then it wouldn't make any difference because one activity was on one of the critical paths, because the other critical path would remain the same, and so therefore the overall project duration would remain the same as well. And that's not what I'm looking for. So I have to go back here to my activities and say, does it make sense anymore to crash E by its last day? So I've already crashed it by 3 days, but can I crash it by another day to get the effect that I'm looking for? Well, let's look at it. If I go back to my network diagram again and look at activity E, this bottom path now has become critical as well. So even though I've got another day to crash E by, and it only costs €5, it's not going to make any difference to the overall project duration because it's not on this bottom path. And if I went and I crashed E and I went down here to my table that keeps track of all my paths, this critical path would reduce from 15 down to 14, but this path would stay the same. And so therefore this path would have the largest duration, that would be the critical path, and so the overall project duration would remain at 15, even though I had crashed E by a day. So I wouldn't get my bonus, and it would be futile to do that. So now, does that mean we're completely halted or scuppered and I can't do anything else? Well, no, not exactly, but it just makes things a little bit more complicated. I essentially have two options. I can look for an activity that is on both paths at the same time. So let's see if there's any contenders for that. This is the first critical path. This is the second critical path. And so there's only one contender for an activity that's actually on both paths. And if you think about it, that would make sense. If I was to crash J by a day, that would mean that both of those critical paths on my table of critical paths would reduce by 1 because J is on both of those paths. In actuality, J is on every path. So by reducing J by 1 day, I would be bringing back the overall project duration by 1 day, and I would get my bonus. So that's option number 1. Option number 2 is, again, if I look at my project network diagram, and rather than crashing J, if I pick one activity on each of the different paths and crash them both simultaneously, then that would have the same effect. So for instance, if I were to crash activity B, which is on this lower path, and activity E, which is on the original critical path, and if I was to crash them both simultaneously, the effect on my project paths will be similar. And again, I'm just going to focus on those two paths. So E is on the first, our original critical path, and so that would reduce by 1 day from 15 down to 14. And B is on this new critical path, so that also would reduce from 15 down to 14. And so therefore, the overall project duration would reduce from 15 down to 14, and I would get my extra day's bonus. So that's another option. Which of those two options should I choose? Well, this is where the costs come in. And this is where it's useful to actually put in costs in all my calculations. Because out of those two options, as a project manager, I want to do the one that is best for me or most beneficial to me financially. And so if I look at crashing J will cost €8. Crashing B and E together will cost the combination of those two crashed costs. So 4 and 5. 4 plus 5 is 9. So crashing B and E will cost me €9 to do it per day. but crashing J will only cost me 8. So the best option is to crash J by 1 day. And I can see that that's all I have with it. I can only crash it by 1 day. So let's go ahead and do that. So again, to bring the overall project duration from 15 down to 14, I'm going to crash activity J asterisk, because I've only 1 day to play with, and this will be it maxed out. It's going to cost me €8, so 135 plus 8 is 143. I'm going to get another day's bonus for that, so minus 48. And so 143 minus 48 gives me 95. Now you can see here probably already, because it's costing me €8 to crash J, and I'm only getting €8 of bonus, well, it's not going to make much difference to me financially. So we're keeping an eye on that. But let's go ahead anyway, keep a track of the project paths so we can see how it plays out. J asterisk, J is on all of these different paths. So all of these different numbers here are going to reduce by 1. So 15 goes to 14, 14 goes to 13, 14 goes to 13 on that path, 11 goes to 10, and that last path, 15, goes to 14. So I have reduced the overall project duration by 1 day, because again, those two paths, this path here and this new critical path here, they're still the two paths with the highest durations. J has been maxed out now. I can't crash it anymore. So let's just, for argument's sake, go on to the other option that I was talking about before, which was just this B and E, crashing both of those simultaneously, because E is on the first original critical path, B is on this new critical path. If I bring them back or peel them back 1 day at a time each, the overall project duration will come back by a day. So B and E together, they cost 4 plus 5, which is €9. So let's try that out. The overall duration will come from 14 down to 13. The different activities crashed is B, which I don't know if I've maxed that out. B, no, I've got 2 days to play with there, so I'm going to leave it like that. B, comma, E, which is the last day I can crash E with. So I'll put an asterisk beside that because I've crashed it 3 days already and I can only crash it by 4. So B and E together cost €9, so €143 plus 9 is 152. Another €8 will be given back to me by the client by crashing it for another day, so that's minus 56. And so the total cost is 152 minus 56, which is €96. So I can see again, this total cost, it's starting to creep back up. So the optimum schedule is one of these two, but let's keep going anyway. Just let's see the effects of crashing B and E together. It will help us if you're trying to do one of these other activity crashing or project acceleration questions again. So keeping track of my paths, B was crashed and E was also crashed at the same time. E is on this path, so that goes from 14 down to 13. Neither E nor B is on this second path, so that stays at 13. E is on this third path, so that goes from 13 down to 12. Neither E nor B is on this fourth path, so that stays at 10. B is on this last path, so that goes from 14 down to 13. So again, I've achieved what I set out to achieve by crashing those two activities. The overall project duration has come back by 1 day, but at the same time, I've got another critical path has arisen. So now I've got 3 critical paths, which is perfectly feasible. It's perfectly possible to have that. I can have lots of different critical paths all at the same time. And so if I were to go any further, I would again have to apply the same logic, but make sure that each of those 3 different critical paths were being brought back together. Otherwise, the overall project duration wouldn't be changing. But it doesn't matter in terms of this question, because essentially we've got what we were looking for, which is we've got a low point here in terms of total cost to me, the project manager, when I'm balancing off the cost of crashing activities and the actual amount of money that I'm getting from the client in terms of a bonus. I've got these two options here. They're both costing me €95. So you might be asking, well, what's the correct answer? What's the optimum schedule? Well, here's where your discretion can come into play, but the way that I would argue it is I would say that it's costing me the same, €95. The project client probably would like it in that day earlier, so I would go for this option here, bringing the overall project duration in at 14 days with a total cost to me, the project manager, of €95. And again, just to write that out, optimum schedule at a total cost of €95 for 14 days in duration. And this was achieved by crashing I by 1 day, C by 1 day, E, now just be careful here, we're going for this option here, so at that stage we had only crashed E by 3 days, and finally J by 1 day. And giving as much information as possible to the project managers that are working with me or to my client, we should also list that the critical path structure has changed slightly. And we'll take note of that. Critical path is, well, we've got this critical path. And we have this other critical path as well. That last critical path that cropped up didn't crop up at the node, at the point that we were taking note of. So I'm just going to list these two critical paths. There's two paths there. And that's an example of how to achieve project acceleration, or is also known as activity crashing. Good luck in your questions.